Yes, this is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're broadcasting from the UN Climate Summit right here in Katowice, Poland. And we're continuing our conversation with Greta, who's been on a school strike calling for climate action. She sits outside the Swedish parliament every Friday. In September, before the election, she sat for 3 weeks straight on weekdays. A number of kids also then started to join her. We're also joined by the renowned climate scientist Kevin Anderson, professor in climate change leadership at the Center for Environment and Development Studies, Uppsala University, also chair of energy and climate change at the Tyndall Center for Climate Change Research at the University of Manchester in Britain. Kevin recently tweeted, on climate change, Greta Thunberg demonstrates more clarity and leadership in one speech than a quarter of a century of the combined contributions of so-called world leaders. Willful ignorance and lies have overseen a 65% rise in carbon dioxide since 1990. Time to hand over the baton, he writes. Well, it's great to have you both with us. Greta, explain again how you made it to Poland, how you got here from Sweden.
Yeah, me and my dad drove here in an electrical car.
Do you use an electric car all over Sweden, or do you use other forms of transportation?
Sometimes that, and sometimes train, bus, subway.
Mm-hmm. I also understand you do a lot of bike riding.
Yeah.
So, Kevin, how did you get here from Britain?
Oh, I came from Sweden as well, actually. So I didn't come by electric car. I came by train and then got the ferry from south of Stockholm to Gdansk, and then the train down to Katowice.
So that's a political decision that you've made as well.
It is, but
you don't take planes?
No, but I don't think about it particularly anymore. I don't look at the flights and say, well, what the flight's like. I just look at how do I get there without flying. Why without flying? Well, it's probably emblematically, it's the most important activity that we pursue. The emissions are important. They're 2 to 3% of world emissions, about the same as UK, Germany or California, so a significant amount of emissions. But actually, when we fly, we are locking in an industry that is very high carbon, that there are no technical alternatives in the near to medium term to overcome that, so we remain high carbon. And also those of us who fly, generally, we also live very wealthy lives. We often use taxis, we live in big homes, we have quite large cars, we drive a lot, we consume a lot of goods. So it is emblematic. It captures the worst excesses in terms of our climate change impacts and also indeed broader sustainability. And so I think it's important for people who work on climate change, who think it is a really major issue, that we demonstrate that we believe in our own research by making some significant changes to how we operate our own lives.
Greta's father, Svante, is named after a climate scientist. Can you talk about his significance?
Well, his significance was major, as were a number of people in the 1800s. So when people talk about climate change as a new phenomenon, it's not. It's the laws of physics. There's no such thing as climate science. There is science we use to understand the climate. And that science we've been using for several centuries now. And during the 1800s, there was Fourier, there was John Tyndall, the namesake of the centre I'm involved with, and there was Arrhenius in Sweden. And these people were pulling together a fairly clear vision of what was causing not climate change, what was understanding global warming, and the greenhouse effect, and how that might play out in the future. So we had a good understanding, even in the 1800s. So it's not a new phenomenon, as the skeptics often try to suggest.
So you teach in Sweden as well as in Britain?
I do, but in English in Sweden, I hasten to add. I don't teach in Swedish.
So what did you think when you heard about this kid, this 15-year-old girl, this young woman named Greta Thunberg, who sat down in front of the Swedish parliament? When did you first hear this?
Well, it was, I think, after you'd first started doing it, so it was quite some time ago now. And as soon as I heard about it, I just think it's good that something is... Well, firstly, bringing climate change to the fore, to the public debate, is important. It's not in the public debate. This COP is being very poorly represented in the media that I'm aware of in other parts of Europe. So bringing climate change to the fore is a really important issue anyway. The second thing is to bring it to the fore with a degree of clarity and honesty is also really important. And Greta has done that in spades. She's been a real ambassador for understanding climate change without all of the fluff and nonsense that we put on.
When you sat down, Greta, in September in front of the Parliament. Was there a discussion in the media? I mean, Sweden considered a very green country about climate change?
Yes, it was, and it still is. I mean, all of Swedes say, oh, we're the best in the world. We have technology and we have low emissions and so on.
So you weren't satisfied, though?
No.
Why?
Because we aren't.
In what way? What are the effects that you feel climate change has in other parts of the world? And what has it meant for you to be here, meeting other people and young people from especially the developing world and from island nations that might be submerged?
I mean, Swedes are living like if we had 4.2 planet Earths. And I mean, that means that we steal very much resources from future generations and poorer parts of the world. And I mean, it's us, the people in the rich countries and the rich countries that have created these problems.
Kevin, can you talk about the difference between the Trump administration being here? Their one side event yesterday was introducing representatives of the fossil fuel industry. They call it realistic and rational because they care about jobs, they say. And the previous administration under President Obama.
Well, firstly, I think you have to question whether they care about jobs or whether they care about profits. Certainly there's something that they care about. But whether a lot of people I know, people who are concerned about climate change, think of Trump, and they use Trump to some extent as an excuse for the inaction of the rest of us. And if you look at what Obama had planned, Obama's climate plans, okay, were slightly more progressive or less unprogressive, if such a thing can exist, than compared with Trump. But nevertheless, Obama was not moving the US towards anything approaching the Paris Agreement. His plans were much more in line with a 3 to 4 degrees centigrade of warming. And people were just saying, oh, isn't he doing well? So Trump comes along and basically just stands up and, in the usual Trumpian way and just says, I'm not going to be involved in climate change. It's a hoax by the Chinese. And that suddenly brings climate change to the fore. People start to talk about it again. So the Macron talks about what the French are going to do. The Chinese say they'll step up to the plate to compensate for what America's doing. Other American mayors come to the fore. So in some respects, Trump has reignited a stagnant debate on climate change. So whilst I have no time for Trump's views on climate change, or indeed on many other issues, I think he has been to some extent a catalyst. And when you align that with Greta's contribution and increasingly voices who feel that they've been marginalised over the last 20 years on climate change, they are coming to the fore. I think there is a sense of a new dialogue emerging, not just from climate change, but from the sort of dissatisfaction with how the establishment has dealt with issues over the last 20 or 30 years.
I mean, going back to Copenhagen, going back 10 years ago, you had President Obama flying in, and many felt weakening the accord.
Yes, yeah. I mean, the US, it's easy at the moment with people pick on Russia, the US and Qatar and so forth, saying they're weakening haven't accepted the IPCC 1.5 degree C report. And it's true they haven't done that, but again, that is something that the rest of us have hidden behind. The other nations will say, isn't that appalling? The UK say, of course we should accept the 1.5 degree C report, whilst it's just celebrated a new BP oil platform going offshore that's going to produce 120,000 barrels of oil every day. That's 50,000 tons of carbon dioxide every year. Every day, rather, and over the life of the platform, another 250 million tons of CO2. That's a UK government saying we must sign the 1.5 degree C, we must welcome the 1.5 degree C report from the IPCC, whilst it's celebrating new oil platforms, it's trying to develop new gas, and it's expanding its airports. So we mustn't hide behind Trump or Obama's inadequacy. The rest of us, the rest of the progressive world, are still failing. As Greta points out, even in Sweden, which in many respects is a very progressive country. If you come from the UK, it feels like that. But even in Sweden, they're choosing to do nothing significant on climate change.
Well, let me turn to that side conference, the side program that was held yesterday by the U.S. shortly before he was interrupted by protesters at a forum on the sidelines of the COP on Monday. COP, it's called for Conference of Parties, this UN climate summit. President Trump's advisor on energy climate, Wells Griffith, praised what he called a U.S. energy renaissance.
Some of the most important factors leading to this renaissance were the dramatic breakthroughs in hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling, which has led to increasingly efficient production of natural gas and crude oil. As a result, the United States is now the #1 combined oil and gas producer in the world. Technological advances are also driving the growth and reducing cost of renewables as well. And the same technology revolution is also making U.S. fuels cleaner by nearly all measures.
So there you have the climate advisor to President Trump. Your response, Kevin Anderson.
Just look at the numbers. This year, carbon dioxide emissions have gone up by 2.7%. That came out during the COP, the latest set of data. And when you unpick that, okay, it is easy to blame China and India, the poorer countries, trying to industrialize. Their emissions are certainly rising. You look at the US emissions have also gone up. And that's because they've been burning far more oil in their cars, which are even larger than they were last year. So even in the US, he can talk about renewables, but really the focus by him and by the advisor and by the Trump administration is just producing and consuming ever more fossil fuels. There is no responsibility there for the issues of climate change. It is a complete denial of climate change, which in a sense is a denial of physics. It's a denial of science. So it's not to be surprised. We should not be surprised by what he is saying. We must not use that as an excuse again, just to beat him and the Trump administration for when we are making no changes ourselves.
We have to be realistic, not alarmist.
Yeah, I agree. We have to be realistic. We have to be realistic. Is it reasonable to live with 3, 4, or 5 degrees centigrade of warming? And I think all analysis, probably even his own, if he bothered to undertake any, would say that is not realistic. So we are left with we're between a rock and a hard place. We have to make dramatic reductions in our carbon dioxide emissions now to ensure a stable climate for our future and Greta's futures and Greta's children's futures. Or we have to just let things carry on with this realistic view about oil and gas today, knowing that we are leaving this legacy for future generations and for all other species, which will be completely chaotic.
Let's talk about who's responsible for the majority of greenhouse gas emissions. An Oxfam study found only 10% of the world's population produces approximately half of all global emissions.
Yes.
Take it from there.
Well, firstly, although Oxfam used that data, that originally came from some work by Lucas Chancel and Thomas Piketty. And Piketty is well known for his work as an economist. And that demonstrates that rather than necessarily always focus on countries, we need to focus on the people who are actually emitting. So the idea that the 10% of the global population are responsible for 50% of global emissions, or 20% of the global population are responsible for 70% of all global emissions, tells us that we need to be tailoring our policies towards that small group, rather than trying to squeeze the emissions out of the majority of the world's population, who are hardly emitting anything at all. So one of the ways to explain this that I often use, which will hopefully be helpful, is that if that 10% of high emitters reduce their carbon footprint, their individual carbon footprint, to the level of the average European citizen, that would be equivalent of a 1/3 cut in global emissions, even if the other 90% did nothing. Remember, a 1/3 cut in global emissions just from the 10% reducing to the level of the average European citizen.
I want to ask Greta about this in 1 minute, but if you can lay out for us who consumes what in the United States, in the Western countries, and places like Sweden, how much energy they consume versus someone in the developing world?
Well, if you look at it in relation to their emissions, if you looked at, say, Rwandans, they might be consuming or might be emitting something like 0.1 to 0.5 of a ton.
People in Rwanda.
Yeah, people in Rwanda, yeah. If you look at the typical American, they're going to be consuming or emitting something like 30 to 35 tons. 30 to 35 tons for the average American compared with 0.1-ish for the average Rwandan. So you're seeing a massive difference between those two.
And what are people doing, like in the United States, in Europe? And how does people in the United States and Europe compare?
Well, very approximately, America is twice, the US is twice the emissions of the average European. But
because?
Well, because they have bigger houses, bigger cars, they travel further, they still have a very high carbon energy system for electricity generation.
You can't find an incandescent light bulb in Europe that's being sold?
No, they've been outlawed now or banned, yes. Yeah. So, Europe has made some significant attempts to improve efficiency, but now those attempts in efficiency have never compensated for the increase in growth. Hence, the European Union's overall emissions have remained roughly static if you take into account of the goods that we import and export.
So, Greta, as we end this show, What message to the world would you like to share? And what are your plans for the future? What grade are you in now in Sweden?
In 9th grade.
In 9th grade. You can look directly into the camera as you speak.
My message for the world is that we have now a short period of time where we can act. And if we don't take that chance, we're screwed, and so we have to take that chance to act now, because it might be too late, and we don't want to be screwed.
Greta Thunberg, 15-year-old climate activist from Sweden, just named one of the world's most influential teens by Time magazine. She came to the UN Climate Summit here in Poland by electric car driven by her father. And she sits outside the Swedish parliament every Friday with a school strike. We've also been joined by climate scientist Kevin Anderson, professor of climate change leadership at the Center for Environment and Development Studies, Uppsala University. He's also chair of energy and climate change at the Tyndall Center for Climate Change Research at the University of Manchester in Britain. He, too, made it to the UN Climate Summit, doesn't fly planes, as Greta doesn't either, by train and by ferry. This breaking news, Time magazine has announced it's honoring persecuted journalists as its 2018 Person of the Year. The magazine has published 4 covers for its annual special issue, honoring the slain Saudi-born Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi, who was murdered in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, Turkey on October 2nd. Also honored Filipina journalist Maria Ressa, founder of the independent news site Rappler. She was recently indicted on what's widely believed to be bogus tax evasion charges in the Philippines. To see our interview with Maria, go to democracynow.org. Also on the cover of Time's special issue are the 2 Reuters journalists, Walon and Cha So, who are currently imprisoned in Burma for investigating a massacre of Rohingya Muslims. And finally, the Capital Gazette of Annapolis, Maryland, where earlier this year a gunman opened fire, killing 4 journalists and another staff member. Time magazine is calling their tribute The Guardians and the War on Truth. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Nermeen Sheikh, Dennis Moynihan, Carla Wills, Tammy Warrenoff, Sam Alcoff, John Hamilton, Robbie Karen, Hani Massoud, Sharina Nadura. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for joining us.